I got an email from Ron Maxwell, director, producer, and he wrote this to me, and I thought it was very, very important. He wrote, "It's not safe, guys. We're not in Kansas anymore. Steer clear of any and all urban areas. One wrong turn could be the last one taken. If it's in a Democratic-controlled city, there will be no police, no one to protect you. Here's the hard truth. We're now living in a partially occupied country. If the Democrats win the national election in November, it will become a totally occupied country. Their 21st century version of the brown-shirted thugs of pre-war Germany, posing as the opposite of what they really are, will be rampant all across America. Others have endured, even triumphed in these conditions, but it took time. Decades. We must look to their example. Lech Walesa in occupied Poland. Václav Havel in occupied Czechoslovakia. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union. To pretend otherwise is to indulge a dangerous delusion. When you cannot speak your own mind without fear of retribution or even of physical harm, you're no longer living in a free country. When you realize that you are pre-editing what you say or what you write in public, you are no longer living in a free country. When you are not safe in your own streets, you are no longer living in a free country." And he's right. He's right. Chaos is coming to Mayberry, writes Leo Hohmann of leohohmann.com. The majority of Americans still have no idea that they are living in the midst of a low-boil civil war. They sit back on comfy couches, watch on TV or computer screens little snippets of the new normal. They see chaos enveloping large cities, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, Baltimore, Chicago, New York, D.C., but don't believe it will come to their small city or the suburbs. They believe Dr. Anthony Fauci and certain health experts who tell them it's best to stay inside, even as they watch increasingly shocking events play out on their illuminated screens. For the lack of a better term, let's call these people the believers. They take whatever is said by their favorite media personalities, their politician of choice, at face value, and have lost all ability to engage in critical thinking skills if they ever had any to begin with. They'll only realize that they are being herded like sheep into a new type of society, where authorities talk down to citizens and bark orders at them like a parent would scold a child after the low boil gets turned up to a roaring flame. The heat has in fact already been turned up from low to medium, as attacks on random cops and Trump supporters have resulted in death and severe injury to dozens in the above-mentioned cities. The cancel culture is escalating. It's no longer just people's freedom of speech being curtailed, but their very thoughts. To sit in silence as the revolution proceeds is no longer acceptable. You must actively and enthusiastically voice your support for its twisted values. White silence is violence, shot the protesters, described in the media as mostly peaceful. Own your white privilege and learn to control your implicit bias. The HR departments of big corporations instruct their human capital, formerly called employees. It's been going on for years at public schools, universities, and corporate workplaces. But now the thought police are venturing outside of these spaces to engage with the general public. And you never know when you might encounter one of their jackbooted thugs. It happened in Roanoke, Virginia last Friday, August 28, in an incident that did not get reported in any media until now. Joe Mantle, not his real name, was sitting with his girlfriend in an outdoor dining area along the downtown square in Roanoke about 6:30 p.m. They were among about 100 diners enjoying a summer evening of rare socializing during the ongoing COVID-19 restrictions imposed by Democrat Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. Roanoke has a black mayor and a black police chief, but that hasn't stopped large crowds of Black Lives Matter protesters from holding rallies throughout downtown demanding an end to what they believe is the nationwide targeted killings of black men by systematically racist police departments. Suddenly, while dining near the 202 restaurant in the city market area, Joe heard loud voices along the street leading to the outdoor cafe. A group of at least half a dozen men, dressed all in black with black face masks, entered the outdoor dining area. As they moved to the center, they started talking to diners in an aggressive manner. Now, Roanoke is no tiny town. Its population is 100,000. It's home to several small colleges, but nor is it anywhere near the size of Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, or Washington. The intruders, who appeared to be in their early to mid-20s, identified themselves as Black Lives Matter. When Joe saw what was going on, he got up and approached his waitress. "We're not here to support BLM. We didn't come here for that. We're not going to have a conversation about this." And that made them, the agitators, very angry, he said. "We'd already ordered our food. I told the waitress, I'll pay you for the dinner, but we're not going to stay under these circumstances. You can either control the environment or we have to leave." Well, not seeing any police or any action on the part of the restaurant staff to remove the agitators, Joe and his girlfriend got up to leave. "I just told her we're going to walk back to my place 3 or 4 blocks away, so we walked down a side street toward my apartment." That's when things got, as Joe described it, pretty crazy. After they'd proceeded about 1.5 blocks from downtown, Joe noticed 4 of the black-clad agitators, 3 white men and 1 African American, heading toward the couple yelling, "No justice, no peace." "I didn't really know what to do. They saw us and we saw them," Joe said. "They started walking faster toward us. I just told her to run in the opposite direction and try to get back downtown area where all the people were. I can't run because I have a foot issue." She was frantic and upset. "I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I wasn't going to let them run over the top of me. I'm just not that type of guy." Joe, an options trader and former radio talk show host in his early 50s, tried to stay calm, believing perhaps he could draw on his gift of gab and talk his way out of a dangerous situation. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes. The more they engaged, the angrier the group of agitators became. "It came down to this," Joe said. "They said, you either raise your fist in solidarity or you get on the ground and lay before us and beg for forgiveness." The 4 men were yelling at the top of their voices at me. As the conversation started to run in circles, Joe could see it wasn't going anywhere. He issued the following ultimatum. He said, "I will not be lying down before you, and I will not be raising my fist. So I would suggest you calmly walk away from me right now," he said. The 4 men started laughing. One of them leaned toward me and tried to hit me with his right arm. I just ducked out of the way and he missed me. Then I hit him in the throat as hard as I could. He landed on the ground, Joe said. The other guy proceeded to attack me, so I hit him hard. They could not breathe. One was crying and the other was screaming in a lot of pain. The third Black Lives Matter thug flew into a rage. "I'm going to kill you right now," he yelled. I just put my hand to my side, didn't say anything. He took a bold swing with a stick, which looked like a broom handle. I caught it in my hand, and I caught him off guard, and he went face first in the sidewalk. I think he broke his nose. There was blood everywhere. When he looked up, the 4th Black Lives Matter agitator was gone. The other 3 were getting up and walking away. By the time a police officer arrived, all of them were gone. My girlfriend saw it all from a distance. It was only our 5th date. She was like, "I've never been on a date like this in my life." I said, "Well, neither have I." Joe stands 5 feet 11 inches and weighs about 198 pounds. He said at least 2 of the attackers appeared bigger. "I never imagined something like this would happen in Roanoke. I've seen it happening elsewhere since they started calling for defunding the police," he said. But looking back, the signs were there. He said Black Lives Matter held daily protest rallies for weeks in front of the city police station. The mayor of Roanoke, Sherman Lee, allowed BLM to paint its anti-police graffiti on a portion of the highway leading up to the center square. Quote, he's a Democrat mayor, so he let them put that out there. On a personal level, I've asked to speak to the mayor about financial issues related to the budget, and he refused to have a conversation or meet with me. But ironically, the lady from Black Lives Matter said she had met with the mayor 3 or 4 times. I told her, imagine that. I'm trying to look out for the financial fortunes of the city, and you're with what I consider a terrorist organization. You get to meet with the mayor, but I don't. Joe won't be going downtown anymore. He won't be eating downtown anymore. He said we were having a great time up to the point they started harassing people. We've never seen anything like this before in our city. There will be no more freedom in the world if we fail to stop this in America. If you stand up to them, they're less likely to cause problems, and that's what we need to do as a town, as a county, as a nation, he added. And sheriffs need to deputize people right now to be ready to defend their towns. These in-your-face public demands to submit to BLM are not just happening in Washington and now Roanoke. Rochester, New York, right there in a McDonald's. Rochester, New York, an elderly couple eating outside a restaurant. Remember, the believers will need to see the violence right in their own city or county before they'll acknowledge there's a problem. They don't realize they won't be able to sit this one out. They won't be able to watch on the sidelines and stay above the fray. The believers have been conditioned. And I'm talking about, by the way, when he talks about all these suburbanites who feel they're going to vote Democrat. The believers have been conditioned to believe technocrats like Dr. Fauci, the politicized scientist who picks and chooses the science of the day based on how he wishes to manipulate the herd. They appear to represent the majority right now in America, living in an alternate reality of their own convenience. They're the ones who wouldn't hesitate to call the police or the health inspector on a restaurant owner who wasn't requiring masks, or the grocer who isn't making customers obey all the rules laid out by the government. But others of us aren't so gullible. They have discernment to read the signs of times and are already preparing for the day when the lever currently set on medium boil gets turned up to high, whether it comes next week or next month or next year. They know it's coming. They know it's coming. It's coming. It's here. It's spreading. See, the number one defense we have against the Marxist anarchists is law enforcement. When George Soros funded scores of elections for prosecutors had no intention of prosecuting criminals and every intention of prosecuting police officers, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was funding a counter-revolution in the United States. These radical progressive mayors in these cities, when they're watching the riots, the looting and the burning, they have no stake in small businesses. They have no stake in capitalism. They have no stake in defending, quote-unquote, white people or even people of color who are part of the system. The Democrat Party has been a very evil and diabolical party for a very long time, with little periods of respite here and there. But it had no problem being the force behind slavery and the Civil War, no problem being the force behind decades of segregation. It had no problems of being the force behind decades of violating the voting rights of minorities, with poll taxes and literacy taxed, Jim Crow generally. It had no problem fighting every single civil rights act that's ever been offered. And now, of course, it uses the very same people it used to abuse to continue to try and gain power. And now they call themselves democratic socialists or progressives. They're Marxists. an American form of Marxism, but they are Marxists. And they will do whatever they have to do for power. It's party first. Now, after the bottom of the hour, we're going to take a little bit more time so you can understand exactly what's taking place here, who's behind it, and the ideology that they are embracing. This is why when people say, Mark, what do you do for a hobby? This is what I do. I study freedom and I study tyranny. This is what I do. And more on tyranny when I return. I consider this one of the most important programs I've ever done. So I hope you'll stick with me. I have in front of me several books. Most of the people who've written these books you've never heard of before. But they've had enormous influence on this country. People say ignore the elitists, ignore the intellectuals. Never ignore the elitists, never ignore the intellectuals. And by elite, I don't mean substantively elite. I mean the so-called masterminds. They're the ones who push the agenda. I have a book in front of me called Marx and Education by Jean Anyon. Ever hear of Jean Anyon? Radical Possibilities, Public Policy, Urban Education, and a New Social Movement. Jean Anyon. This is just tip of the iceberg. Ever hear of Herbert Marcuse? Well, every living Marxist has. Everybody in Black Lives Matter has. Everybody in Antifa has. And half the members of the Democrat caucus in Congress have. He was a Marxist philosopher in France and then in the United States. Case Studies in Diversity and Social Justice Education by Gorski and Pathini. Ever hear of them? This one you know. Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky. Jay Rosen, What Are Journalists For? One of the individuals who has radically altered, in a tremendously harmful way, journalism in this country. I have scores of books like this. These are the people who are fundamentally transforming your nation. They're not alone. Colleges and universities are filled with tenured professors like this. Now, you've heard of Cloward and Piven. I've talked about them many times. Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloward. Both professors. Columbia. Wrote many, many essays. And I want to read something to you. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. The title of the collection of essays for this book they have is The Breaking of the American Social Compact. I think that tells you what they want to do. They say the American Social Compact was forged in response to the protest movements of the 30s and 60s. Now, after 2 decades of relative quiescence by the poor and the working class, the programs are under sustained attack. Unless new protest movements emerge, the victories of the 30s and 60s will be rolled back, indeed are already being rolled back. Now, when you hear them talk about the poor, it doesn't really matter. They could be talking about blacks, Latinos, Hispanics, it doesn't matter. They say we think poor people win, and by that they mean minorities and others, mainly when they mobilize in disruptive protests. For the obvious reason they lack the resources to exert influence in conventional ways, such as forming organizations, petitioning, lobbying, influencing the media, buying politicians. By disruptive protest, we mean acts such as incendiarism, riots, sit-ins, other forms of civil disobedience, great surges in demands for relief benefits, rent strikes, wildcat strikes, or obstructing production by stopping assembly lines, or, burning down buildings, interrupting people at restaurants. They call it the disruption argument, which they first made in 1963. Mass disruption, they say, both its emergence and its successes, is closely related to electoral politics. On the one hand, poor people, or you can say Antifa or BLM, do not ordinarily rise up if they sense no support from at least a significant fraction of regime leaders, as is likely to be the case when the dominant party is secure. Then these people are likely to be treated roughly or ignored, and when a regime is insecure, it is more likely to bargain actively for support. It may then issue appeals which signals vulnerability to demands from the bottom. In other words, you burn enough stuff, you loot enough stuff, you riot enough, disrupt enough, then the system will bend. The regime will become insecure. Now, you've seen that in many cities, haven't you? And they go on. Of course, I'm not going to read the whole book. Once protest movements and electoral dissensus, so rather than consensus, they coined this word half a century ago, dissensus. In other words, breaking up. Once protest movements and electoral dissensus subsided in each period, the victories won were eroded. The losses are not likely to be reversed easily. To save social programs, it's likely to take protests, at least on the scale it took to win them. In other words, riots. Some signs of mass protest have emerged in other advanced capitalist countries, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, for example. The question is whether such protests will continue and spread even in the United States. Gee, I wonder. Will it? They go on. Social movements thrive on conflict. By contrast, electoral politics demands strategies of consensus and coalition. Movements have the impact they do on electoral politics mainly because the issues they raise and the strife they generate widen cleavages among voter groups. We call this dissensus politics to differentiate it from the usual process of building electoral influence by recruiting adherents, assembling coalitions, or what might be called consensus politics. We think the evidence suggests that movements play a large role, perhaps a determining role, in the periodic electoral de-alignments and realignments that bring new regimes to power and usher in new public policy eras in American history. Other conditions must also be present before movements can cause destabilizing cleavages. Movements are not likely to have much impact unless economic and social conditions are already eroding established electoral alliances and allegiances and coalitions. So the coronavirus was exploited by these people. They sat and they waited. Then the George Floyd thing hit, and they ignited the gas. It was all planned. It was all planned. They talk about the significance of dissensus politics, in other words, of destroying alignments, of consensus. Once the role of parties in electoral democracy is acknowledged, so is the likelihood of a host of systematic distortions of voter preferences. To understand the importance of movements in electoral politics, we must appreciate not only the influences that distort the essentially democratic mission of organizing voter majorities, but the deeply conservative tendencies of electoral politics, even apart from such distortions, in a two-party system. To win state office, party leaders and their candidates must build broad majorities. They strive to do this by holding the allegiance of those who voted for them in the past, while attracting marginal voters for the contending party. To do this, they try to avoid conflict and search instead for the consensual appeals and promises that preserve, and if possible, enlarge existing voting coalitions. And so they write that their job is to destroy that whole narrative. They say what we need, because of the immobility of the two-party system, is an electoral realignment through periodic convulsions called realignments. We need an accumulated political tension resulting from the failure of the party system to respond to the problems generated by a dynamic capitalist economy and static party system. And so they must press, they say, the potential for realignment which the two parties seek to suppress. Just as people had to be mobilized to support parties they write and the issues and candidates they put forward, so do they have to be mobilized to desert them. Social movements are often the mobilizers of disaffection. We think social movements are politically effective precisely when they mobilize electoral disaffection. A fragmented governmental system in the United States means that the opposition party usually continues to control some part of the government apparatus, and so it is itself constrained by the need to hold together a majority by promoting consensus. And by the way, you know who their target is, Mr. Producer? The Democrat Party. They say we must control the Democrat Party. The Republican Party is useless. We must control the Democrat Party. And they do. Bernie Sanders knows exactly what I'm reading to you. Ilhan Omar, Rashid Tlaib, AOC, Presley, they know exactly what I'm reading to you. To appreciate the role of social movements in helping to precipitate electoral convulsion and realignment, we have to pay attention to the distinctive dynamics of social movements that enable them to do what party politicians do not. We emphasize the defiant and disruptive strategies of protest movements that arise among lower strata groups that have few regular political resources. We think the argument we're making here helps account for why disruptive protests, such as strikes or riots, sometimes force reform responses from the state. Social movements tend to emerge at moments when the electoral system itself signals the emergence of new potential conflicts. Signs of increased volatility appear in electoral politics, usually traceable to changes in the economy or social life that generate new discontents or encourage new aspirations. So they're opportunists, you see. The evidence of voter volatility, in turn, may prompt party leaders to do what they characteristically do to attempt to hold together their coalition. Only now they will employ more expansive rhetoric, acknowledging grievances among their constituents that are ordinarily ignored, or naming and thus perhaps fueling aspirations that are only beginning to emerge, like systemic racism. Oh, yes, yes, yes. And you see how the corporations follow, too. After the riot, oh, there's systemic racism. Oh, BLM, and painted on our courts and in our streets and all the rest. Movements can break the monopoly of the politics, at least for a brief moment. Movements mount marches and rallies, strikes and sit-ins, theatrical and sometimes violent confrontation. The inflammatory rhetoric and dramatic representations of collective indignation associated with these tactics project new definition of social reality. You see all this. Or definitions of the social reality of new groups into public discourse. They change understandings not only of what is real, but what is possible and what is just. As a result, grievances that are otherwise naturalized or submerged become political issues. Movements raise new issues, and when new issues take center stage of politics, the balance of political forces changes, and it goes on. That is exactly what's taking place. Riots. Changing the language. Changing the issues. With the system buckling. Looking for accommodation. Looking for peace. The universities. The corporations. Professional sports. All appeasing and, if not worse, embracing the disintegration of the civil society. The demands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa have nothing to do with race. Race is a fig leaf. You'll notice more and more of the people rioting under the nomenclature Black Lives Matter are white. So it could be race, it could be the environment, it could be immigration, it could be economics, doesn't really matter. I watch the suckers, LeBron James and others, Oprah Winfrey, who throw in with this and don't have the foggiest idea what they're throwing in with. I watch the never-Trumpers and people like Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse who have no idea what's taking place in this country. They think they're smart, they're actually quite crude and stupid. Most of the Republicans have no idea what's taking place in this country. The president does, instinctively. Instinctively. Which is why they hate him with such a passion. They were hoping for a Bush or a Romney or a McCain type or something like that who would buckle. Trump is not buckling. Trump is not accommodating the Marxist left. He's fighting them. He's fighting their mouthpieces in the media. He's fighting their intellectuals in academia. He's fighting them in the culture in Hollywood, and he's fighting them in the Democrat Party. This is beyond conservative liberal. It's beyond Republican Democrat. Well beyond. The reason why you didn't hear a single person utter a single syllable about the riots during the Democrat convention is because the Democrat Party is now part of the Counter-Revolution, just as it was leading the way during slavery and triggered the Civil War, just as it was leading the way in segregation that went on for 100 years, just as it opposed virtually every Civil Rights Act. And now it's leading the way to the destruction of a constitutional republic and a capitalist system. The Democrat Party is a vessel through which hostile ideologies work their will on this country. That's exactly what's taking place now. This group, Black Lives Matter, is not about blacks. It's about overthrowing the country. That's what it's about. So when you have fools like LeBron James and fools like Oprah Winfrey and fools like Nancy Pelosi and fools like Chuck Schumer, they bend to this. Now, Kamala Harris, I want to talk about her for a moment. We'll circle back, but I want to get to some of this. This guy, Jacob Blake, raped repeatedly his former girlfriend. Did things to her that I cannot discuss on the radio. That day he was shot, did things to her that I cannot discuss on the radio. He brutally sexually assaulted her, including in her bed when one of her 3 children was sleeping right next to her. She already had a protective order to prevent him from coming close to her, but he didn't care. He didn't care. He's a felon, not a victim of anything. He had 3 of his own kids in tow. He resisted arrest. They tased him twice. It had no effect. Got into a physical brawl with the officers, with their guns drawn, but it didn't matter. Then he walks around to the driver's side of the car, opens the door, reaches in, and he's shot. Turns out there was a knife on the floorboard. His father, you know the old line, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, has said some horrific things about Jews, about Christians, about this country. a thorough and complete anti-Semite, which is a huge problem and growing in the black community. So Kamala Harris visits the family. She says it's a wonderful family. Kamala Harris is proud of Jacob Blake Jr., the man who sexually assaulted, raped his ex-girlfriend, despite the fact there was a protective order. Counts included third-degree sexual assault, criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, and a criminal complaint that had been issued by the state of Wisconsin. And yet, sports figures, Hollywood figures come to the man's defense. Kamala Harris didn't think to speak to the victim, to the ex-girlfriend. So much for the Me Too movement. Kamala Harris, who believed every allegation against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, she was proud to meet Jacob Blake. She's proud of him. Proud of him? Joe Biden goes to Kenosha, Wisconsin. And in Kenosha, Wisconsin, he's proud to meet the family. That would be the same Joe Biden who just a few months ago, Kamala Harris said that she believed the dozen or so women who came forward and said that he had fondled them inappropriately. Kamala Harris is a demagogue. She's a very, very dangerous individual. Very dangerous. So the woman who was repeatedly abused sexually, repeatedly abused, domestic abuse, got no attention whatsoever. None. Just like Tara Reade. Tara Reade accused Joe Biden of molesting her, of raping her effectively, digitally. No big deal. Me Too movement, not a problem anymore. Megyn Kelly. Kudos to Megyn Kelly. The Hill newspaper picked it up. Megyn Kelly slams Kamala Harris for saying she's proud of Jacob Blake. Proud of him, wrote Megyn Kelly. He's accused of breaking into a sleeping woman's house, sexually assaulting her, humiliating her, and later returning to harass her. Then the cops she called for help say he resisted arrest, assaulted them, and went for his knife. How about a word for his victim, Senator? Then you have Ben Crump showing up everywhere, the civil rights lawyer for Blake. In a moving moment, he says, Jacob Blake Jr. told Senator Harris that he was proud of her, and the senator told Jacob that she was also proud of him and how he's working through his pain. Really? Police said a knife was found in Blake's car after police shot him in the back, and they claimed he ignored orders to drop it, so he had the knife. But, of course, his attorneys dispute the claim the knife was in his hand, and so forth. No, you're supposed to believe that the officers showed up and they just shot the guy in the back 7 times. That's it. That's all you saw in the video. Tiana Lowe, writing at the Washington Examiner, writes, for every Jacob Blake, there are millions of Jacob Blake's victims. Millions. And the women in the suburbs who feel they're going to vote for Joe Biden because he's such a decent guy. And Kamala Harris could be the first woman vice president, maybe even president. There's no reason to be proud of either of these political hacks. Either of them, for anything. It's absolutely appalling. And now they run ads that in Donald Trump's America, all this violence is occurring because they think you're stupid. They think you're stupid like the base of the Democrat Party is stupid. They think the American people are going to buy the fact that the President of the United States has the power to move into these cities and into these states and to put down the riots. Joe Biden hasn't called out a single mayor. Why? Because they're Democrats. Joe Biden hasn't called out a single governor. Why? Because they're Democrats. Now he's upset about the riots. What are we, day 110 or something in Portland, and Joe Biden now is talking about the riots? He didn't say a damn thing about it until now because the polls show that the American people are concerned about this? Concerned about the riots? Let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. What exactly would Joe Biden and Kamala Harris do about the riots? We haven't heard a thing. What would they do? They won't even tell their party colleagues, the mayors, to put down the riots. What would they do? They wouldn't do anything. They have no intention of doing anything about the riots. Why? Because they're part of the counter-revolution. They've embraced Black Lives Matter. They've embraced Antifa. How do I know that? Not only by their silence in the face of looting and burning and all the rest of it, but I read their 110-page document, their Communist Manifesto. It might as well have been written by Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and was by Bernie Sanders. It is an extremist document that will touch each and every one of you in profoundly horrific ways. Whether it's your schools, whether it's your communities, whether it's your health care, whether it's public safety, whether it's your income. They don't only want to tax income, they want to tax wealth. That is, things that you've accumulated and already paid taxes on. Do you know this? They want open borders. Illegal aliens get free everything, including health care. This is who they are. They're going to destroy Medicare, destroy Social Security, because the more havoc, the more anarchy, the more people turn to government. It's an odd thing, but it's true. And the bureaucracy is owned hook, line, and sinker by the Democrat Party. The Republican Party has no idea what's taking place in this country. You hear the platitudes when some of them show up on Fox, but they have no idea what's fundamentally taking place in this country. Tim Scott has no idea what's taking place in this country. None. Mitch McConnell has no idea what's taking place in this country. These are not race riots. This is a Marxist counter-revolution. These ideologues, these professors, these idea people, the masterminds, they're Marxists. And so they'll use race if they think it'll work. They'll use the economy if they think it'll work. They'll use immigration if they think it'll work. They'll use climate change if they think it'll work. It doesn't matter. But they're poised. They're poised. And the virus, and the shutdowns, and the unemployment. Bureaucrats still getting paid but staying home. Teachers, for the most part, still getting paid and staying home. Millennials not going to college. Perfect. The stars are all aligned. And then blame Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump fights back. He doesn't roll over. He won't accommodate these counter-revolutionaries. He fights back. They would much prefer a Romney or a Ben Sasse or George Bush or your typical Republican. That's what they prefer. Not a fighter who pushes back.